Hello and welcome to episode 37 of That 60s Recording Podcast. That's where I got the 60s from. The podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. And this week I have part 2 of my conversation with Steve Jackson of Pultec. Lots of great feedback about the first episode. I'm glad you're all really enjoying this. Steve is such a lovely guy. I always say it, as is everybody who I speak to, but it was such a pleasure to speak with him. So I hope you enjoy the remainder of this conversation. And we begin by digging into how he scaled up production, if you could call it scaling up, from sort of building one unit at a time to building enough units to make commercial production viable. Just before we get on with that, I'll tell you that my stems that I'm sending out on my mailing list this week are What Goes On, the Ringo number from Rubber Soul, which was actually incredibly difficult to play, and not least because it's been absolutely roasting in the UK this week. The studio is generally quite warm, insulated, so it stays kind of cool-ish, but I was sweating buckets by the end of doing this. So yeah, ridiculous. But I hope you enjoy that. You can get that by signing up to my mailing list at allyouneedisdrums.com. And one reminder before we go into the episode, that if you'd like to support this podcast by buying one of my enamel mugs, you can do that on my website too. It's allyouneedisdrums.com, and then there's a link to the shop there. So anyway, let's get straight into this episode with Steve Jackson, part 2. Here we go. Going back to sort of before, to sort of the moment where you've got this unit that's working now, what were the challenges in terms of, from your maybe personal perspective, having to then learn about manufacturing on a larger scale and all that kind of thing? How did you approach that?
Well, so like I said, I worked for Hewlett-Packard for 25 years, and one of the things that HP has always done is I was in research and development, but HP always had a very close alliance between R&D and manufacturing. And you didn't just design something and then throw it over the wall and say, okay, you guys go make this, and I'll start my new design project. You followed it into production and worked on that. And so I had a lot of experience with supply chain management and, working with manufacturers and suppliers, with quality control, with just manufacturing processes and making sure that, the process is stable and reproducible. And one of the things that I'm very proud of with the Pultec is that our tolerances, for example, for the transformers, but also for the capacitors, we have those custom manufactured and they're made old school. If you take a 330 nanofarad 200 volt cap, like is in one of the stages of a Pultec, you can find that today in a tenth the size package, but it's not the same as that cap that they made back then. There were reliability issues with the dielectric that forced them to use thicker dielectric than what we would use now. They no longer have that defect density that requires the thicker dielectric. And so they've shrunk everything. And I didn't want to use the modern components. I wanted to use the same ones that he used. And so I found a company that would custom wind these caps to the original specs using the thicker dielectric and reproducing that. They're also wound to tighter tolerances. Back in Gene's day, 20% was a pretty good value for accuracy of the capacitor. On critical caps, we go to 2%. On most of the caps, we're at 5 or 10%, but on the critical ones, we go to 2%. And on the inductor, we're able to hold much tighter tolerances than what the original inductors would maintain. And so, when you're building a peak boost circuit that requires that inductor and that capacitor, um, you know, we nail it every time because we're using higher precision components. And so we can build a unit, maybe 5 years ago and have the customer come back and say, I want to get a second unit and use it on my stereo bus. And we're highly confident that we can build that unit to the exact same specs that their 5-year-old unit has. And, that's important to customers that you don't see all this variability coming off the production line, that it's very consistent. And so I think that's one of the things that I brought to Pultec that maybe wasn't there in the old days just because they didn't have that option.
Yeah. You've got sort of the benefits of modern technology, but you're doing it. So you're using, as you said, like the old school components, but they're manufactured in a modern way, which gives you, if anything, it's probably more, significantly more accurate than Pultecs were back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Presumably,
Exactly.
there must have been a lot of variation between how some of them sounded, depending on what was happening.
So actually, I think the product coming off the production line was relatively consistent in the old days, but what it required was for them to go through and do a lot of component matching. So you'd have to go through and a box of 100 capacitors and then bin them out and say, okay, here are these, and then here are these, and here are these, and that takes a lot of extra effort, a lot of resource labor, and that's something we don't have to do. I don't know. That's one of the questions that I failed to ask Gene, but I'm just kind of speculating on that.
Yeah. When you sort of went into manufacturing, the company relaunched, as it were, what was the reaction of sort of the audio world in general? Was there skepticism about about what you tried to achieve, or were people generally open and excited about what you'd done?
I guess I'd say both. There was tremendous speculation. And if you watch that Alan Sides video on our website, it's very representative of the reaction. When I approached him with the Pultec, he was very skeptical, and he said, yeah, go ahead and send it to me. We'll give it a listen. And then I got the phone call back from him, and he was like, wow, this sounds just like our Pultec. And, there was a lot of that. There was a shootout that Dave Collins and Greg Wells and Hunter Crowley, and I believe there was another person involved in it. It was out in LA, and they had a premium vintage Pultec. They had another manufacturer's Pultec knockoff, and they had one of mine. And I think that was really what kind of launched things. Was after that shootout, there was so much discussion on what was at that time named Gear Sluts.
Yeah.
I believe they're now Gear Space.
Yes.
And anyway, there was so much discussion on that. And, Greg just was telling everybody he knew. And around that same time, Jack Douglas demoed a pair. And, as we got the units into the hands of people that, were recognized as having good ears and knew what a Pultec was supposed to sound like and got their reaction, then things really just took off. But it was pretty much all word of mouth. It was a matter of getting it into the hands of a few people who, had credibility. And then other people would go, well, where can I demo? How can I demo one? And they would, get one or get a pair, and then they'd refuse to give them back. It's like, no, I don't, I was demoing this, but now I don't want to give it back. How much for me to keep it? So, and so we'd have to build more to replace the demo units. And, um,
Are
but,
you keen to restrict, or do you restrict the amount that you make, because just to keep the quality consistent, or um, presumably that's something that you consider that you could, obviously you wouldn't, but you could go in and do sort of mass manufacturing techniques, but I suppose you're keen to keep it all in house and the quality as high as you possibly can, and just keep all of that reputation intact.
we actually started out with external manufacturing. Like I said, I built I built all the early prototypes, and then I found a place locally that was that was one of the biggest challenges. Now that I think back on that, that was a long time ago. But I remember shopping this around to Fort Collins is in a fairly high tech area. It's about an hour north of Denver, along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, and we have multiple Hewlett Packard facilities. We have Intel. We have a lot of high tech industry in this area, and so there are lots of places that do electronics assembly. But when I would shop, my sample Pultec around to these places, they would look at it and, oh, that's like all point to point wired. We haven't done that in 20 years. And I really started to get frustrated, thinking, great, we've got this thing ready to manufacture, and I can't find anybody who can assemble it. And there's no way I can be, working evenings and weekends building these things. So I happened to find a place, L&L Assemblies, that had done a lot of hand assembly like this. And the owner of the company said, yeah, we'll bid it. And they came in with, a reasonable number. And so they started building the prototypes at that point, 3 or 4 or 5. And then the early production units, and then the person who was actually doing the assembly for them ended up buying the company. And so I started working with her and her husband, and for a number of years, they built all the units. I would load them up with parts, and they would provide finished units, kind of like what Gene was doing back in the day. And then they reached a point where they wanted to retire. And I thought, oh boy, here we go again. And fortunately, I was able to very quickly find another place that did contract assembly, and worked with them for a while. I guess about two and a half years. And then one of their people asked me if I'd ever thought about doing it in-house. And I had a space that I was leasing, where we would do the inspection and the testing, and we'd warehouse all the components and everything. And I, after a great deal of thought, decided to go that route. And so we now have, like I said, we've got 3 full-time people, and then a couple of part-time people. One guy comes in and does inspection and test, just part-time, but we have multiple people doing full-time assembly. And so we've actually brought all the assembly in-house. And COVID last year, I thought, March and April, I thought, oh boy, the economy's going to tank. This is going to be the end of the company. We had a good run, but, this is going to be the end of it. Instead, I was stunned to see that orders started coming in more frequently and larger orders, and realized that, wow, with all these, studios closing their doors and people having to work from home, a lot of these engineers and artists and so forth, producers, they're all working out of their home studios. They've got to beef up their home studios. And we've actually had to hire, we're in the process of hiring somebody else now, because we can't keep up with the orders.
Wow.
So yeah, I don't know how long that'll last. You know, I always knock on wood, and I'm thankful for, you know, the success that we've had, but I realize, you know, at any time the orders could stop coming in, and, you know, you just don't take anything for granted.
What do you think for the future of outboard gear? I mean, there seems to be a huge, uh, I mean, maybe resurgence is the wrong word, but there's a huge respect certainly for outboard gear at the moment, and there is for plugins too. But there seems to be a real healthy balance developing between the two of them, and I personally think that companies such as Pultec, these legacy companies, are gonna have got a healthy future ahead of them. But what how do you see it?
I think the same. You know, especially for something like a Pultec, it's a very unique product that, you know, Gene designed some magic into this box, and I was fortunately able to recreate that magic. Um, I I never could have designed it from the ground up. You know, I was able to reverse engineer it, and I'm thankful to that. But I think that's something that once people have experienced it, they want it in all their recordings. And so I think there will always be a demand for Pultecs, you know, whether people are using them on the way in, you know, to track, or using them, you know, on their mix bus to add, you know, some extra life, you know, to their mixes if they're mixing completely in the box. And I think, you know, most engineers, you know, especially if they're working in a home studio, they want that one or two things, that, you know, that one premium mic, or that one premium EQ, or that one premium compressor. They can work with a lot of other stuff, you know, for the generic, but on their vocal, you know, on their guitar solo, whatever it is, you know, they want that one special box that gives them the magic that just takes their mix over the top. Um, and so I'm hopeful that people will continue to order Pultecs.
I'm interested in the way that you have started to sort of develop into to the future, and it seems to me that you've done it in a really sympathetic way. I mean, I'm particularly thinking about the mastering series that you've got, with the stepped, the dials are stepped as opposed to just just sort of, I don't know what the good terminology is, but loose, and that seems to
Right.
be a really ingenious and subtle difference between units that makes it suitable for a modern audience, because people do want recallability, and
Right.
suddenly I think that's a really brilliant way of embracing the future without compromising what you're doing too much. And how have you approached sort of setting yourselves up for, in terms of 500 series stuff and the mastering series range?
So the stepped controls, the mastering units, that was something that sort of evolved a little bit. You know, when I first got into the Pultec game, you know, obviously in 1998, 99, I knew very little about Pultec other than the studio that I'd worked at back in the late 70s, had a couple of Pultecs, and they sounded great, and I knew that I wanted, you know, one for my studio. But obviously, as I got into the game and I started talking to more and more engineers, people that had used them for 20, 30 years, I started learning a lot about how people use them. And one of the biggest frustrations that people had was in trying to find a pair of Pultecs that were matched to each other well enough to use on the mix bus. And so it became very clear that, you know, that was something I needed to take into account with these units. I needed to make sure that, you know, number 37 sounded just like 28, and 15, you know, that, you know, they weren't varying widely, as we talked earlier, so that I needed to have a good control over the production. But then the potentiometers were something that you can find a pair of let's say we order, a batch of 500 high frequency boost pots. They're going to vary. They're, at best plus or minus 10% tolerance on the absolute resistance. So you can go through and you can measure them and you can say, okay, well, here's one that's, 9.98K, and here's another one that's 9.97K. Those are really close. But when you start looking at the taper is not necessarily matched as closely as the absolute value of the element. Do you follow?
I do, yes, yeah.
So if I set, even though their absolute value is the same, if I set one at 40% rotation, and I set the other one at 40% rotation, they still might be mismatched a little bit. And I've got to sit there and either, use my VU meter or use my ears or whatever to try to match them. And I knew that wasn't really going to be acceptable. And so that's when we came up with the idea that, well, if we use a 21 position switch and we use 1% precision, metal film resistors, I mean, that was really nothing new. There lots of people had done that with various products, and so it was obvious that we needed to apply that to the Pultec. What I did that I think took it another step beyond was, instead of just matching the original curves, when you only got 21 steps, you've either got to, if you make uniform step size, then you know what your max boost and max cut are. You have to decide, do I want higher precision or do I want wider range? And so what we came up with was this varying boost or cut. So they're half dB steps for the first 50% of rotation to give you that high precision and obviously close tracking. So that's really important on a mix bus application where you don't want your stereo image moving. You want, if you're set at 4.5 on one and 4.5 on the other, you want them to be boosting exactly the same level. And so the left and right, are matched and the image stays in the center or wherever, your pan is set.
Yeah.
But we had people saying, well, yeah, that's great that you've got that high precision. On the early units, we opted for half dB steps all the way up. And sorry, I got a little off of where I was headed.
I'm enjoying listening to it. It's great.
On the early mastering units, we said, okay, they're half dB per step all the way up. That limited them to 10 dB boost or cut. And so we had people that are, buying this expensive product and they can use it on their mix bus. It gives them the precision. But hey, I kind of wanted to use this on my kick or on my snare or on my guitar, and I wanted that 20 dB of boost that I can get out of a conventional Pultec. You took that away from me. Now the most I can get is 10 dB. And so we went back to the drawing board and I came up with alternative tapers that give the half dB per step for the first 50% of rotation. And then we go to larger step size as you go past 50%. And so when you rotate fully clockwise, you're at the same max boost or max cut that a potted Pultec will give you. But on the low end, which is, honestly, you're never going to be boosting 20 dB on the mix bus. If you are, there's something wrong with your mix. And so it kind of gave the best of both worlds. And people immediately, people that bought those, we got instant feedback that, oh, this is perfect. I've got that precision, for the 1.5 to 2 dB that I want to tweak, on my mix bus. But when I'm using them for tracking or mixing, now I can use it. I can get, the full 20 dB on my snare to really, give it that crack that I want.
That's, I think that is incredibly clever. I think it sounds like you're really listening to feedback and taking it on board and applying it in a sensible way, which I think not a lot of manufacturers do listen so attentively. How did you go about developing the 500 range? Because obviously, I suppose, I'm a 500 user, and
Uh-huh.
it's it's almost a necessary evil these days. It's a condensed version of a unit, and it's convenient, and less, it's not as expensive as buying a 19-inch rack unit all the time, and it takes up less space. So it's something that not all companies have done it, but you've embraced it. And how did you go about moving into that world?
So the full story on that is maybe a little embarrassing, but I'll tell it anyway. So I had kind of had tunnel vision. I was desperately wanting to come up with a 500 series product. Obviously, 500 series are very popular. The first real console that I worked on in a recording studio was an API 2488. It was this would have been about 1977, and it was a 1976 console, so it was like brand new.
Yeah.
And I love API, just my favorite console. And so I really wanted to have, and that was where the 500 series came from, was from an API.
Yes.
Paul Wolf created that, the first lunchbox, and really got the 500 series concept going. And I just somehow had tunnel vision. I kept focusing on trying to make how could I get a tube unit into a 500 series module? And there are just all sorts of limitations. You've got to have a 300 volt supply, and you've got to be able to deliver actually quite a bit of current from that supply. And there's multiple transformers. There's obviously the input, interstage, and output transformer. And I just kept coming back to the fact that this is going to end up being like 3 units wide. And why would anybody ever burn 3 or maybe even 4 units? This just doesn't make sense. And even though we've been manufacturing the solid state units for a couple of years by that point, it somehow hadn't occurred to me that, wait a minute, the solid state unit only has an input and output transformer. They're much smaller than the output transformer in the tube unit. You've got a single 2520 op amp, and so all of a sudden it was just, the answer was just sitting there right in front of me. It's like, okay, we'll do the solid state in a 500 module. And even that was challenging, because we use the same input transformer, input and output transformer that is used in the solid state rack mount unit, and they're pretty beefy transformers. That's one of the reasons they sound so good. But I spent a few months working out the details. I had my sheet metal guy that does all my CAD is just really brilliant, and he helped me tremendously in trying to figure out how to pack all this stuff into the small volume that we had. We used the same brand of switch that's used in the full size units, so we didn't cut corners on it at all. We made sure that everything that was in that rack mount unit, top quality potentiometers, top quality switches, like I said, the same transformers, and obviously the same API 2520 op amp, and managed to pack that all into the EQ P1A was the first one, and then we did a 500S to emulate the 1S3, 1S versions that have the high frequency shelf boost and some extra frequencies. And then ultimately ended up consolidating that into the X, which kind of takes the A and the S and just merges them, takes the best frequency selections from both. And so it gives you the 16K peak boost in addition to the 5K and 10K shelf boost. So it really gives you a lot of options on the top end. Um, and then, the Jack Douglas series, I've been talking to Jack about doing some sort of signature uh, model with him. And he's the one that got me to do the MEQ5 initially. After he got a pair of the EQ P1A threes, you know, he would call me up regularly and ask me, when are you going to do the MEQ5? When are you going to do the MEQ5? I'd never used an MEQ5. I didn't really know, much about it. I'd seen pictures of it, but it certainly doesn't have the iconic status that an EQ P1A or 1A3 has. And so, one of the times that he asked me when I was going to do it, I said, so what's what are the benefits of that? What's the big deal about the MEQ5? And he said, oh, it just happens to be my favorite guitar equalizer. He said, all of those Aerosmith records, Alice Cooper, the guitars, almost all of them went through an MEQ5. And, whether it was bass guitar or six string or whatever. And so anyway, when we came out with the MEQ5 and then ended up doing the solids, I'm sorry, the 500 series, it was obvious that, okay, the MEQ's got to have Jack's name on it. He was the driving force behind this. What I didn't realize was I pretty much already filled the volume inside the 500 series module, and now I was going to try to add a bunch more components to it. So yeah, that took probably another 6 months to figure out how to get that 10 pounds of stuff into the 5-pound can. But people seem to really love them. So and it's a great entry point. People that don't have the money to buy the full-sized units, can start with a 500 series. And typically what we find is that, once they get a taste of it, then they somehow find, the resources to get, the full-size unit, and they don't stop using the 500 module. They use it in parallel with it. It's a different vibe. It's a different animal. So, it adds, more colors to the sonic palette.
Is that the same thing you see with sort of plug-in version of things? So the UAD one and even Waves has got a version. I suppose that they're incredibly accessible, and then once people have used a plug-in, they'll want to hear the outboard version, and then they go for a 500 series, and they that makes a huge difference, and then they, as you say, graduate to the 19-inch rack version. But is your experience with the plug-in version similar, that it just helps introduce a new market to what you're doing?
So yeah, we used to get approached all the time at like AES and NAMM. Remember back when we had trade shows? I'd have people come up to the booth, and we always have a really well set up listening station. We have a pair of them at trade shows with really good isolation headphones and high quality wave files, for the samples. And we've got, our Pultec set up where you can listen to all the different models. And the typical conversation, somebody will come up and say, oh man, I love Pultecs. I've been using their plug-in for, the last 2 years, and I use it on everything. I love it. And I'll respond with, oh, great. Have you ever listened to a real Pultec? Well, no, I'd love to hear one. And they put the headphones on, and you just watch their eyes get big and the smile grow on their face. And they're like, oh my gosh, I love the plugin, but this is just so much beyond. Now, just to make I'm a little hesitant about going down this path, but just a comment. There's only one company who actually worked with us and who licensed the Pultec brand, and that is Apogee. And in my opinion, I think they have absolutely hands down the best Pultec. I think it comes the closest to the the physical Pultec of any of the plugins. And, maybe since I last heard, one of the UA plugins, they've gotten better, but we've directed a lot of people to check out the Apogee Pultec plugin, and most of them come back to us and say, wow, you're right. It really is, the best that I've heard. It does sound better than the others. So, but what we have seen is that people try the plugins, they get a taste for it, then maybe they get a 500 module, or maybe they go straight to the full size solid state or the tube units. But yeah, once they get a taste of the plugin, then they want the real thing. And it's the nice thing about the plugin is you can have 6 or 8 of them, where maybe you can't have 6 or 8 EQ P1As. We do have some clients that have 6 or 8 EQ P1As, but not everybody can do that. So.
No. What's do you have? You may not even want to talk about it, but do you have future ideas for things that are coming, or are you happy? Have you filled your quota of things that you're putting out, or are you going to keep pushing forward?
Well, I've been trying to resurrect the MB1 mic pre. It was an original Pultec product back in the day, very popular back then, and people that have them now love them. The input transformer for that is a very challenging transformer to build, and it's taken us a while to get that done. We have final protos on that, and just need to get it into production, and that will enable not only the mic pre, but also there's a compressor that a guy by the name of Bob Fine, he owned Fine Recording Studios in New York City. They were a powerhouse back in the day, and he took one of Gene's original mic pre's, the MB1, and added an opto loop to it to make an opto compressor out of it. And I have those original design documents. It was never a Pultec product. In fact, I have a letter. It's kind of sad. It was I guess I'd call it a rejection letter. It was a letter to Eugene Shenk, asking him if he would be interested in producing it, and Gene basically responding saying, at this time we're not interested. But there are maybe a dozen or so of these Bob Fine compressors out there in the world, and the people that have them just absolutely love them. There are a couple of studios in New York that have a pair of them, and they're incredible. And that's a product that I would like to bring bring into production for the first time. I had thought, with COVID, that I'd be able to knock out some of these projects, but instead, I've been overwhelmed with all the orders we've had, and just trying to keep up with supply chain, issues. And, like everybody, suppliers are quoting longer lead times and, difficulty getting their raw materials and that sort of thing. And so it's chewed up a lot more of my time than I would have liked. And so hopefully, by the end of the year, I'll have both of those products into production. But that's what I thought this time last year, and that didn't happen. So,
well, it's a good position to be in. It's as they say, it's a sort of a nice problem to have.
Exactly.
That does sound exciting. I'm excited to try those out. That would be great. So our final two questions. Do you have any? So I'm kind of specifically talking about the EQ P1A. Do you have any specific settings or ways of using it that you would recommend, or any little tidbits of information like user guidance that you would recommend, or are you purely manufacturing side of it?
I wish I had a lot more experience with them than I do. As I mentioned, the way I got into this was starting to build a home studio, and I just wanted a couple of Pultecs to be able to use, in my side gig of recording. And Pultec has consumed pretty much all of my time so that I never get to go into my studio. Yeah. I mean, obviously I've spent a bit of time in front of a Pultec, and, just let your ears be the guide is really and that's what I see most people doing, at trade shows when they're demoing them, is just, turn the knobs until it sounds good to you. It's pretty much impossible to get a horrible sound, out of a Pultec. They're just, that's one of the characteristics of them, is that, they're very forgiving, and, you can boost 10 or 12 or 18 or 20 dB, and it doesn't get harsh. It just, it's just, it's kind of a magical box. But yeah, I mean, I guess my advice is let your ears be your guide.
And then finally, this is something I generally ask all the guests. So the story of where you're at today is unbelievable. It's incredible to hear it straight from you. And if you had any advice for anybody, just sort of not necessarily embarking on this, because this is quite a unique story, but in terms of what you've achieved by bringing back pulse techniques, what advice would you either give yourself, or could you impart based on your experiences of bringing the company to where it is today?
I think, follow your passion. It's what led me down this road. I, worked in the recording industry in the late 70s and early 80s. And then, after getting married, my wife and I, decided to go to college. I, put a lot of time into that, got, my bachelor's, and then ended up going on for a master's and PhD, and worked in optoelectronics and VLSI, high speed interfaces and that sort of thing. Again, staying mostly in analog electronics, but I always knew that, at some point I wanted to get back and be playing my drums and pushing faders, and, even if it was just as a hobby. And so that's really, that was my passion, and that's what I started following, and it led me down this road. And, I'm incredibly fortunate to be at the helm of a company like Pultec. Just, it's a small, like I said, it's a small business, but it's so iconic, and I still sometimes have to pinch myself and say, how'd you end up here?
It sounds to me like you're probably you'll probably sort of not want to agree with me necessarily, but I think that you're uniquely qualified to do exactly this job. It seems to be that your experiences and your enthusiasm for it, and seem to have culminated in this being just exactly the right fit for you.
I think so. I think it was kind of the perfect storm. Maybe, a little bit of obsession along with the passions.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
And there we have it, Steve Jackson. I hope I get to meet him one day in person. He's so lovely, and there seems to be a nice little audio community that I'm sort of skirting on the edge of, that I've seen, and of which Steve Jackson and Ivana Manley and all of those kind of guys are all members of, and it seems really nice. They're all lovely. So next week, my episode is with Bob Olson, who was the in-house mastering engineer at Motown, which I'm really excited about because I haven't featured Motown a huge amount on the podcast. So I think, I say a huge amount at all. It's mainly been UK music, but we've touched on San Francisco. We've done a little bit on the Wrecking Crew. So I'm really excited to have someone from Motown speak with me. And as you'd expect, Bob is absolutely lovely. So it's a great couple of episodes coming your way. So that'll be next week. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can do that. My email address is joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. You can visit my website, www.allyouneedisdrums.com. I'm also on Instagram at allyouneedisdrums. And that just leaves me to say a big thank you to my good friend Joe Kane and David Henshaw for the music and the artwork for this podcast. And I will see you all next week. Goodbye.